The stadium trembled with an energy that transcended the ordinary excitement of athletic competition, a tension that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the arena and spread outward through the assembled crowd like electricity through water. In the luxury boxes positioned high above the track, men in expensive suits shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their attention fixed not on the performances unfolding below but on the implications those performances might carry for carefully constructed arrangements that had governed their nations for generations. The race about to begin was no mere sporting event. It had become, through a combination of historical circumstance and deliberate political calculation, a proxy battle in conflicts that extended far beyond the boundaries of any athletic competition. The young black athlete positioning himself in the starting blocks understood this dimension of the moment more clearly than the spectators who had come merely to witness athletic excellence. He had been briefed, warned, threatened, and cajoled by officials who wanted him to understand that his performance would carry consequences that reached into realms he could barely imagine. The event in which he was about to compete had been designated strategically significant by governments that saw sports as an extension of political warfare, an arena in which ideological superiority could be demonstrated through the accumulation of medals and records. His nation's adversaries had invested heavily in this particular event, developing training programs and identification systems designed to produce champions who would prove the superiority of their political and economic systems. A victory by a black athlete representing the opposing ideology would constitute a propaganda disaster of the first magnitude, a refutation of claims about racial hierarchy that formed part of the foundation of their domestic political order. The path that had brought him to this moment began in circumstances that seemed designed to preclude any possibility of athletic achievement. He had been born in a region where the color of his skin determined every aspect of daily existence, where laws encoded the fiction of racial difference into the very structure of society. The schools he attended received a fraction of the funding provided to white institutions, their textbooks outdated, their facilities crumbling, their teachers heroic individuals struggling against impossible odds. Sports programs in these segregated schools operated with equipment that white schools had discarded as unusable, on fields that flooded with every rainstorm and baked hard as concrete under summer sun. Yet within these constraints, something remarkable emerged. The boy demonstrated athletic abilities so extraordinary that they transcended the limitations of his environment, his speed and coordination suggesting potential that demanded development regardless of the obstacles that would inevitably accompany any attempt to realize it. Local coaches recognized what they were seeing and began the dangerous work of nurturing talent that the social order was designed to suppress. They secured equipment through networks of sympathetic donors, arranged competitions that would expose him to higher levels of challenge, documented his performances in ways that could be shared with individuals positioned to advance his career. The journey from those makeshift training grounds to the international stage would require navigating a labyrinth of racial barriers, institutional resistance, and political complications that would have defeated anyone of lesser determination or ability. The event in which he specialized occupied a unique position within the hierarchy of athletic competition, valued not merely for its physical demands but for the tactical and intellectual qualities it required. Success demanded not just raw speed or strength but the ability to read competitors, to make split-second decisions under extreme physical stress, to maintain strategic awareness while pushing the body to its absolute limits. Military establishments around the world had studied this event, recognizing in its requirements the same combination of physical and mental capabilities that produced effective soldiers and officers. Governments that understood the propaganda value of athletic achievement had devoted particular attention to developing champions in this discipline, viewing victories as demonstrations of the comprehensive superiority of their systems. The young black athlete's emergence as a contender in this strategically significant event had therefore attracted attention that extended far beyond the normal interest of sports administrators and fans. Intelligence agencies had compiled dossiers on his training methods, his psychological profile, his potential vulnerabilities. Diplomatic communications had discussed the implications of his possible success for bilateral relationships and international perceptions. Officials at the highest levels of government had been briefed on the upcoming competition and its potential political ramifications. None of this had been shared with the athlete himself, who remained focused on the athletic challenge before him while remaining largely ignorant of the larger forces his performance would affect. The selection process through which he had earned his place at this competition had been marked by the same patterns of discrimination that had characterized his entire athletic career. Despite performances that clearly exceeded those of other candidates, his inclusion on the national team had been debated at length by officials who raised concerns that had nothing to do with athletic merit. Some worried about the political optics of having a black athlete represent the nation in such a prominent event, particularly given the racial attitudes that prevailed in certain allied countries whose sensibilities had to be considered. Others questioned whether he possessed the mental fortitude to perform under the pressure of international competition, their doubts rooted not in any evidence of psychological weakness but in assumptions about racial characteristics that masqueraded as objective assessment. Still others raised practical objections about logistics and accommodations, suggesting that the complications involved in supporting a black athlete in certain host countries made his selection inadvisable regardless of his competitive credentials. These discussions continued even as his qualification became undeniable on athletic grounds, his times so far superior to those of his competitors that exclusion would have invited international scandal. The compromise eventually reached reflected the ambivalence of the institutions involved. He would be selected, but he would receive minimal support. He would compete, but he would not be promoted or celebrated. He would be permitted to win, if he could, but no one would invest resources in helping him do so. The training camp that preceded the competition exposed him to forms of discrimination both familiar and novel. He was housed separately from white teammates, his accommodations inferior in every measurable respect. Meals were provided at different times and often of different quality, the message of subordination conveyed through every mundane detail of daily existence. Coaching attention, nominally available to all team members, was directed disproportionately toward white athletes whose development was considered more valuable to the long-term interests of the national program. When he trained largely alone, adapting the program to his own understanding of his needs rather than receiving the individualized guidance that other competitors enjoyed. The isolation might have been demoralizing had he not long since learned to find strength in solitude, to convert exclusion into focus and discrimination into determination. He studied his competitors through whatever footage and documentation he could obtain, analyzing their techniques and tendencies, identifying weaknesses that might be exploited and strengths that would have to be neutralized. The tactical preparation he developed was necessarily his own creation, lacking the collaborative refinement that other athletes received from extensive coaching staffs. Yet this very necessity forced him to develop a depth of understanding about his event that externally supported athletes often never achieved, a comprehension that was integrated into his competitive intuition rather than remaining abstract knowledge separate from performance. The journey to the competition venue brought him into an environment that crystallized the political dimensions of what he was about to attempt. The host city served as a showcase for a political system that explicitly rejected the notion of racial equality, that had constructed elaborate ideological justifications for the hierarchies it imposed and maintained. Signs of this ideology were visible throughout the urban landscape, embedded in the architecture and the public spaces and the behaviors of citizens who had been trained since childhood to accept the legitimacy of racial categorization. International athletes of African descent received treatment that ranged from cool formality to barely concealed hostility, the local population unsure how to process the presence of individuals who contradicted the racial theories they had been taught to accept as scientific fact. He was followed by security personnel whose stated purpose was protection but whose surveillance felt more like containment. His movements were restricted in ways that white athletes did not experience, his access to public spaces limited by regulations that appeared to be enforced selectively. The psychological pressure of existing within this environment would have been challenging even without the additional stress of impending competition. He managed it through deliberate focus, refusing to engage with provocations that were designed to destabilize his concentration, maintaining the internal equilibrium that would be essential when the moment of competition finally arrived. The preliminary rounds of his event unfolded according to patterns that confirmed both his capabilities and the determination of certain parties to prevent his success. His performances in early heats were dominant, his times establishing him as the clear favorite to win the gold medal. But alongside these athletic achievements, he became aware of efforts to undermine his preparation for the final. Training times that had been reserved for his use were reassigned without explanation. Equipment he had brought from home and carefully calibrated was discovered to have been tampered with, requiring last-minute adjustments that disrupted his routine. Sleep was interrupted by unexplained disturbances in his accommodations, the pattern too consistent to be coincidental. Officials from his own delegation seemed unable or unwilling to address these problems, their responses suggesting either incompetence or complicity. He navigated these challenges with the same resourcefulness that had characterized his entire career, finding alternative solutions, adapting to changed circumstances, refusing to allow external interference to derail his pursuit of victory. The other competitors, observing his calm in the face of evident disruption, began to understand that they were facing an opponent whose mental strength might prove as formidable as his physical capabilities. The final of the event gathered a field of competitors who represented the full spectrum of international athletic achievement, champions from multiple continents who had earned their places through years of dedicated preparation. Among them were athletes from the nation whose government had the most at stake in preventing a black victory, young men who had been selected and developed specifically to win this event and who carried on their shoulders the expectations of political establishments that had invested heavily in their success. The atmosphere within the stadium as the competitors approached the starting area was charged with significance that the casual spectator could not fully appreciate, an understanding shared among officials and athletes that this race would carry implications extending far beyond the awarding of medals. In the luxury boxes, the men in expensive suits leaned forward, their attention now fully captured by the drama about to unfold. Diplomatic communications would later reveal that secure telephone lines had been established to transmit the result immediately to government offices in multiple capitals, such was the political weight attached to the outcome. The young black athlete, aware of these dynamics despite never having been explicitly briefed on them, settled into his starting position with a concentration that excluded everything except the immediate requirements of the moment. He had learned long ago that the political significance others attached to his performances was simultaneously useful and dangerous, a source of motivation that could become a source of distraction if allowed to occupy too much mental space. The start of the race triggered a release of competitive energy that seemed to transform the physical reality of the stadium. The young black athlete launched himself forward with an explosiveness that immediately established his presence at the front of the field, his early pace suggesting either supreme confidence or reckless disregard for the tactical demands of the distance. His primary rivals, the athletes whose nations had invested so heavily in their success, responded with efforts to maintain contact, their race plans disrupted by the aggression of his opening. The crowd, sensing that something unusual was occurring, rose to its feet with an intensity that reflected the charged atmosphere pervading the entire competition. He ran with a freedom that seemed to transcend the pressure of the moment, his stride fluid and powerful, his expression focused but not strained. Those who had predicted that the burden of political expectation would compromise his performance had miscalculated badly. The pressure that might have crushed others had been converted, through some alchemy of mental preparation and competitive instinct, into fuel for an effort that pushed the boundaries of what had been considered possible. By the midpoint of the race, the outcome had become a matter not of whether he would win but of the magnitude of his margin. The final meters of the race produced scenes that would be analyzed and debated for decades to come. He crossed the finish line so far ahead of his competitors that the race for silver and bronze had become a separate competition entirely, his dominance complete and undeniable. The time displayed on the stadium scoreboard represented a new world record, a performance that exceeded not merely the capabilities of his opponents but the previous limits of human achievement in this event. The crowd erupted in response that mixed genuine athletic appreciation with more complex emotions reflecting the political dimensions of what had occurred. In the luxury boxes, the men in expensive suits sat in stunned silence, their faces revealing the magnitude of the defeat they had just witnessed. The governments that had invested so heavily in preventing this outcome would need to develop explanations, to manage the narrative implications of a black athlete achieving superiority in an event laden with symbolic significance. The young champion, his body still processing the physiological aftermath of maximum effort, began to comprehend the magnitude of what he had accomplished. He had done more than win a race. He had demonstrated, in the most public possible fashion, the falsity of theories about racial hierarchy that underpinned political systems and social arrangements across much of the globe. The gold medal that would soon hang around his neck represented not merely athletic achievement but ideological refutation. The aftermath of the race revealed the depth of fear that his victory had generated within establishments that depended on racial ideology for their legitimacy. In the host nation, news coverage of the event was carefully managed, his achievement mentioned briefly if at all, while the performances of domestic athletes received disproportionate attention. Government officials who had been prepared to celebrate expected victories instead issued statements emphasizing the anomalous nature of the result, suggesting that it represented the exception that proved rather than contradicted prevailing theories about racial capabilities. In other nations whose political systems incorporated similar racial assumptions, the response followed comparable patterns of minimization and recontextualization. His world record was questioned on technical grounds, suggestions raised about timing equipment that might have malfunctioned or conditions that might have artificially enhanced performance. When these challenges failed to gain traction, the narrative shifted to emphasizing supposed disadvantages faced by white competitors, circumstances that had prevented them from achieving their true potential. The young champion, having returned to his home country, found himself caught between celebration within black communities that understood the significance of his achievement and resistance from white establishments that preferred to treat his victory as an isolated occurrence without broader implications. The years that followed brought continued success on the athletic field but ongoing struggle against systems that his victory had threatened without destroying. He continued to compete at the highest levels, accumulating additional championships and records that reinforced the message of his original triumph. Each victory required confronting not merely the athletic challenge of defeating talented opponents but the institutional resistance of organizations that had never reconciled themselves to his presence in their sport. Sponsorship opportunities that should have flowed naturally from his success were blocked or diminished, the commercial establishment unwilling to risk association with an athlete whose achievements carried political implications that made them uncomfortable. His attempts to leverage his fame into advocacy for racial justice encountered resistance both overt and subtle, those in power recognizing that his voice carried authority that derived from his demonstrated excellence and fearing the use to which that authority might be put. He navigated these complexities with a sophistication that reflected his understanding of the forces he was confronting, choosing his battles carefully, maintaining the athletic focus that was the foundation of his platform while seeking opportunities to advance the broader cause of which his individual success was one expression. The historical significance of his gold medal grew rather than diminished with the passage of time. The political systems that had been most threatened by his victory eventually collapsed, their racial ideologies discredited by historical events that extended far beyond athletic competition. Yet the moment of his triumph retained its power as a symbol of what had been at stake, a demonstration that excellence could emerge from communities that dominant ideologies had designated as inferior. Subsequent generations of black athletes who followed him into international competition benefited from pathways that his achievements had helped to open, opportunities that existed in part because he had proven that limiting beliefs about racial capabilities were false. The gold medal that had terrified the establishment became, in retrospect, a harbinger of transformations that would reshape the political landscape of multiple continents. The governments that had devoted such resources to preventing his success had feared, correctly as it turned out, that black athletic excellence would contribute to the undermining of ideological frameworks on which their power depended. His victory had not caused these transformations, but it had symbolized and anticipated them, serving as evidence that the claims of racial superiority were not merely morally wrong but empirically false. The young black athlete who had stood alone in those starting blocks, bearing the weight of political significance he had never sought, had produced a performance that echoed through history long after the race itself had ended.